nonetheless, it does have quite a few items. There are about 100 items on display, about 80% of which are all real. They're not reproductions, although there are reproductions in this. But we're rather proud of this. It's free admission. Contributions are graciously accepted. But invite you, if you're in the vicinity, to come see us. So can we map the route of the Exodus? In a word, no. Well, maybe you ought to say something else. Anyway, when I got this topic, I thought this is going to be the shortest manuscript in the entire book. If I had the crassness actually to follow through with that, but I knew that Clyde Woods would be all over my case. The topic, however, is of great importance. Let me apologize. I normally do not read a manuscript, but this topic is so complex that I cannot tuck it all in my little brain to have an organized fashion. So I'm going to be reading this, but I hope that I read it with at least a reasonable element that might have some element of interest to it. There will be pictures, so a lot of maps, actually. The topic, however, is of great importance. The believer tries to trace the route of this noteworthy event, while the skeptic quickly latches onto it to try to undermine the credibility of the Bible. Indeed, tracing the route of the Exodus, or even if there was one, has plagued the study of biblical history and has become an avenue by which many scholars would argue that the biblical narrative does not preserve any historical reality. William G. Deaver goes so far as to say that if there is no corroborative extra-biblical evidence, we should not assume any historical accuracy at all. Deaver was my major professor at Arizona. The conservative believer, however, will not subscribe to such a facile approach to Scripture. Nahum Sarna has observed that the Exodus event is referred to, is referred to over 120 times in the Hebrew Bible as a significant touch point of reality. Now, Nahum Sarna is Jewish, and he doesn't care anything about the New Testament. So he does not go into the numerous references and allusions in the New Testament which add weight to the Exodus and subsequent events. The nature of the Exodus is such that the entire basis of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Covenant is severely undermined if the event and its subsequent route did not occur. A number of issues converge to obscure our investigation. The discussion is confusing, convoluted, and challenging because there are so many moving parts for which there is little certainty. One issue is the challenge of identifying the exactly what is meant by the term Red Sea. This leads to another issue, where did Israel cross the Red Sea? And the third obstacle is to identify exactly where Mount Sinai and Horeb are. A fourth is the question of exactly where was Kadesh Barnea located, since the end of the basic journey would help define the route itself. Those of you from the north, route means route. On a certain level, given the magnitude and significance of Israel's flight from Egypt, one would assume that these issues would be reasonably easy to trace. But such is not the case, and proposed locations and identifications for each component are legion. The detailed itinerary of Numbers 33 traces Israel's trek from Ramesses, their starting point, to their final camp at Abel Shittim, sometimes referred to as Abel Acacia Grove in the New King James Version, for instance. With these details, one would expect easily to trace the route, but such is simply not the case. There seems to be little question but that the land of Goshen is in the eastern delta region of Egypt, immediately adjacent to the Sinai Peninsula. The land of Goshen was where Jacob and his descendants settled. Thus, we need to understand that they did not live in the heart of Egypt near the pyramids or southward up the Nile at Luxor or Karnak. They already lived on the edge of the country of Egypt, adjacent to the Sinai Desert itself. But as we pose the question, where was Sinai? How are we to understand the term Sinai? Was it part of Egypt or not? The extent of what is known as Egypt poses a problem. Paul, in Galatians 4, verse 25, notes that Sinai was in Arabia, which has prompted many to place Mount Sinai east of the Gulf of Aqaba And somewhat anecdotally of this, the more prominent proponent of that is Ron Wyatt and others. But interestingly, the Egyptians never used the word Sinai to refer to the peninsula area, but called the region Bia, meaning mining country. The reason for this designation was that they had major mining operations at Serabet El Khadim, mining turquoise and copper, and at other places such as Timnah, where copper was one of the items that they mined. So why does Paul locate Sinai in Arabia? And I think this is a significant touch point as we evaluate this. When narrating Cambyses' movements into Egypt in the 6th century BC, Herodotus identifies what we refer to as the Sinai Peninsula as Arabia. Herodotus wrote during the 5th century BC. Corroboratively, the Septuagint, a product of apparently no earlier than the 3rd century BC, narrates that when Jacob and the family arrived from Canaan during the famine, they settled in the land of Goshen in Arabia. Now, I don't know how good your Greek is here, but this would be where, in order that you might settle in Goshen, Gesem, in Arabia. And it's interesting that the Septuagint adds this element in the translation, apparently for clarification. The land of Goshen was next to the eastern delta, if not part of the eastern edge of the delta. I would infer that Paul used the term Arabia in the sense that it was generally understood at the time when he's writing. For us to impose on it a different or more restrictive meaning would be poor hermeneutics. Similar to our argument regarding baptizo, it needs to be defined within the context of the literature's composition. So we move to the discussion of the Red Sea. Even the identification of the Red Sea is a topic of dispute. As is well known, the Hebrew phrase that is usually rendered Red Sea is the term Yam Suf, and more literally it translates to the Sea of Reeds. Traditionally, this has been identified with the western arm of the Red Sea in what is more precisely identified today as the Gulf of Suez, and that the term applied to some lakes that extended northward to the Mediterranean Sea, along with an ancient canal system that the Egyptians had constructed as well, by which they had access from the Gulf of Suez eventually to the Mediterranean. Some have objected, however, that the crossing occurred at the Gulf of Aqaba, the eastern arm of the Red Sea, because 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26 clearly identifies the Red Sea with the eastern Gulf. This is the start port of Solomon's travels and trade routes as he is dealing with the sea routes. Hoffmeyer, who is an Egyptologist, a believing Egyptologist, emphasizes that the term Suf transliterates the Egyptian word well, and the word means reed, and that it is a mystery why the Septuagint translators rendered it red in the first place. Our Red Sea comes from the Septuagint rendering, but nobody really knows why they rendered it as they did. Given the preponderance of the evidence, both linguistically and logistically, it seems best to understand the term in Exodus to apply to the western Suez-based branch of the Red Sea, which in turn raises the question of why Sea of Reeds would apply to the eastern Gulf, should one evaluate that question. An issue that may contribute to our consternation in the use of the term sea is the use of the term sea itself. From a Western perspective, we tend to define a sea as a massive body of water, such as the Mediterranean. Hence, we refer to it as the Mediterranean Sea. It's huge. And the Hebrew Bible literally refers to this as the Great Sea. In the United States, however, we do not even use the term sea to apply to the Great Lakes. And if you've ever visited the Great Lakes region, those are massive lakes, but nobody that I know of ever refers to them as a sea. Each of the lakes is massive independently. In the Hebrew Bible, however, the term sea applies also to the Salt Sea, which measures 50 miles from north to south and only 11 miles wide at its widest point, which to a large extent is across the ocean, or across the sea in this photograph. This is at En-Gedi looking due east across into the hills of Moab. Similarly, the Sea of Kinneret, otherwise known as the Sea of Galilee, is much smaller. measuring 13 miles north to south and 8 miles wide. And in this photograph, I have a panoramic view, distorted somewhat because of the way the photograph is taken, but from the far southern end on the left-hand side to the far northern end on the right-hand side and all the way across. And yet we still refer to this as a sea. Now, this is a term, and the point that I'm getting at is when we think in terms of the sea of anything, we have a tendency to think in terms of huge. And particularly for those people who have never actually been to Palestine and to Canaan, and I'm not using either of those terms politically, if they've never been to Israel and never visited these, one of the big impressions that people have is how little everything is and how close everything is. I mean, this is a tightly compacted country, and we have a tendency to think in terms of it as sort of the massiveness of the United States. But both the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee would qualify only as relatively small lakes in the United States. Thus, to apply the term sea easily conjures a misconception. Now, I'm not arguing that it's mistranslated. I am arguing that it's a misconception to restrict it according to our definitions. So, there are at least 2 lakes along the line of the Suez Canal that may have served as suitable bodies of water to be called seas, and which were of sufficient mass to cause consternation in the hearts of the Israelites, and which would serve as suitable means by which to drown the Egyptian army. And actually, these are the lakes of Balak near the Mediterranean, and the Bitter Lakes further south. And as one compares the maps here, I've never actually been to either of these lakes in Egypt. One of them, I think, is dried up now. But as we look at the maps, the representation shows that the widths of these lakes rival those of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. And so there may be a perfectly legitimate reference to use the term sea to apply to these lakes. Another problem that arises is, where is Ramses? And what is Ramses? Now, there are 2 different spellings that you'll tend to encounter in this. The biblical account tends to follow a transliteration out of the Hebrew, which usually spells it with 2 A's, R-A-A-M-S-E-S, sometimes R-A-A-M-E-S-E-S. But it apparently is referring to this site of Ramses that was known as Pyrames or Avaris. The starting point for the beginning of the Exodus at Ramses has been difficult to determine until the excavations under the direction of Manfred Bitak at the site called Tel ad-Daba'at. This site was known to the ancient world as Avaris, and it was the capital of the Hyksos at an earlier period. And then it became the southern part of Pyrames, according to Bitak. While there was a town in the vicinity before the 13th century, and I'll come back to this, Ramesses II took over the area, enlarged the occupational footprint dramatically, and transformed it to his residential capital during the 13th century BC. In other words, it became a store city. It became his palatial town. Now, that does not restrict store city to only Ramesses. Obviously, the Bible will talk in terms of Pithom and Ramesses as store cities that the children of Israel were involved in constructing, and we should not infer that there are only 2 that occurred anywhere in the country. But this chronological range of occupation, of course, complicates the discussion in view of the date options for the Exodus, which usually fall into either the 15th century BC or the 13th century BC. And I want to express my apologies to Denny Petrillo for not hearing his lecture yesterday. I had to leave and go actually teach classes at Harding and then come back again. So my apologies to you. I would have loved to have heard the presentation. I did read the chapter. So, but that's so abbreviated, anyway. So, thank you for your generosity. The construction of the store cities of Ramesses and Pithom in Exodus fits the 13th century, in my opinion, much better, since Seti I and Ramesses II had moved the seat of the government to Pyrames, Ramses. Only Ramesses II is known to have done any construction at the site of Pyrames, Ramses. During the 15th century, the capital had been at Thebes, significantly further south and well removed from the land of Goshen. Admittedly, this is not proof that Moses needed to be in Thebes to speak with Pharaoh, since Avaris was apparently a town during the 15th century BC. The Pharaoh at the time may have visited Avaris, thus permitting Moses' audience with him. The presence of Avaris as the location of Ramses proper, however, poses a geographic problem in that the enlarged area, considerably larger than Avaris, is built de novo on the soil. The historian Falk has reported that cesium magnetometry surveys done in 1996, 2003, and 2008 have revealed no remains beneath the Ramesside foundations of the city. So in other words, when Ramesses builds the town and expands it significantly, and there's nothing under it. Now, the other part, the core area that was sort of the periphery, the suburb of the new palatial area, did have some occupational levels underneath it. The early date for the Exodus, that is the 15th century date, interprets the statement of leaving Ramesses as a retrofit of the later name onto the earlier name of the town, similar to what was done with the name Dan in the Genesis narrative of Abraham's pursuit of Lot. You may recall in Genesis 14 when Lot is captured by the Mesopotamian kings, then Abraham musters his force, 318 men born in his household who are trained in military arts, pursues them and passes Dan. But we discover in the book of Judges that the site of Laish is not named Dan until the children of Israel arrive. Now, so this is apparently sort of an insertion for clarification of what's going on. And the suggestion here is that Ramesses is a retrofit in similar fashion. To my knowledge, most scholars, regardless of their skeptical or believing stances, would now identify Tel Deba'a as the start point of the idea, at least, of the Exodus. Please do not infer from that I'm suggesting the Exodus is merely an idea. Then there's the discussion of the way of the Philistines. It is from the start point of Ramesses that the route becomes enigmatic. It is somewhat ironic that the way of the land of the Philistines, the route away from which the Lord steered Israel, is the one we can trace. This route basically hugged the coast from Egypt to Canaan, where eventually the Philistines would settle. The Egyptians, by the way, this is another one of those anachronisms. There apparently weren't any Philistines, at least of military might, that would have existed during either the 15th or the 13th centuries. But the Egyptians had long dominated the coastal route since it was their main trade and military route into Canaan and into the Levant. At least by the 20th century BC, Egyptians had established a line of fortresses along the area to protect against incursions by people from Canaan. During the reign of Thutmose III, around 1468 BC, the Egyptian army traveled the distance from Egypt to Gaza in Canaan in a span of 10 days, thus averaging about 15 miles a day. Additionally, Seti I, around 1291 BC, depicts a series of fortresses along the way, and that's what's shown on the picture below. A series of fortresses along the way, beginning in Egypt and ending in what is modern Rafia at the southern end of the Gaza Strip, and still today called Rafia. Alternative renderings note that the northern route may be called the Wall of Horus, or sometimes the Wall of the Ruler. The reference to the wall may allude to the area of Shur, the wilderness of Shur, mentioned in the Bible. The word Shur literally means wall. And we find this used in biblical text, Genesis 49:22, 2 Samuel 22, verse 30. The Neferti, not to be confused with Nefertiti, these are different critters. Nefertiti was a queen, Neferti is a prophet. The Neferti prophecy refers to a wall designed to stop the Asiatics from entering the land of Egypt. It is almost certainly along this route that Abraham passed when the famine in Canaan prompted him to leave Canaan and sojourn in the land of Egypt. And the Bible will talk in terms of when he's about to enter into Egypt, as if it's some relatively distinct demarcation. And that's when he talks to Sarah and says, present yourself as my sister and so forth, and gets in all kinds of hot water as a result of that. Thus, with the trade traffic and potential military activity, one can understand why the Lord might take the newly called people a different route than run the risk of their immediate discouragement in the face of military opposition. Now, that does not diminish the power of God to defend them, but the children of Israel became discouraged easily enough over subsistence concerns. Why did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Then there's Mount Sinai. The location of Mount Sinai is obviously a critical factor to trace the route of the Exodus. But this effort has run into severe obstacles. But was there a mountain of God? Now, I'm not answering that in the negative, but this is the kind of question that people will pose. Admittedly, the difficulty to identify the location of Mount Sinai has fueled the skepticism of many to deny the historicity of the event. But historically, the Greeks had their Mount Olympus, the Ugaritians and Syrians had their Zaphon, and the Canaanites had their Mount Hermon. While we can identify each of these mountains, there is no intrinsic reason to question the existence of a mountain of God, such as Sinai with the Israelites. Admittedly, it is more difficult to identify. Perhaps part of the reason for the difficulty to identify it is the fact that, as far as we can tell, it was never a site of pilgrimage in the ancient biblical era, with perhaps the notable exception of Elijah fleeing there during Ahab's reign. But then that raises the question, why did he flee there? Was it a site of pilgrimage? That doesn't seem to be the point. Perhaps the obscurity of what was part of God's divine wisdom to permit the identity of the mountain to be lost in order to curtail its identification as a place of false worship. And one can easily imagine, with the mindset that characterizes human beings so much, of something happened here and it becomes then a worship site. I don't know that that's the answer, but at least I think it has some credibility as we evaluate this. A compounding complication is how to identify the connection between the terms Sinai and Horeb. Many modern scholars attribute the two terms' origins to separate strands of literature that were merged to yield the documents as we currently use them. I don't subscribe to this documentary hypothesis strategy. Others suggest that Horeb is the region of a range within which the peak of Sinai rests, somewhat akin to Mount Whitney in the Sierra Nevadas. I'm much more comfortable with that explanation, and the way the terms are used in the biblical account at least conforms to that as a viable explanation. While a number of sites have been suggested as Sinai, there are basically three that deserve some attention. Those three are Har Karkom in modern southern Israel, a location in the south-central Sinai Peninsula, among which the peaks would be, there are three, but I'm not going to go into detail with any one of those, and Jebel el-Lawz in modern Saudi Arabia. How much time do I have left? Where did you go?
15 minutes.
You're not going to get all of this. Of these three areas, the least probable is the site of Har Karkom. This site was proposed by Emmanuel Anate after decades of study in the Negev and southern Sinai and northern Sinai. The site is about 35 miles southeast of what is usually identified as Kadesh Barnea. The route of his proposed exodus would have taken the Israelites from Ramesses, which at the time of the writing had not been identified, but which he had attributed to be in the region of Goshen. The Israelites followed a route that took them along the strand of sandbars that protruded into the Mediterranean, eventually leading them slightly toward the interior of the Sinai Peninsula to Har Karkom. While the route seems to run the high risk of putting the Israelites in the way of the feared way of the Philistines, a more careful scrutiny of his proposed identification shows major weaknesses of his proposal. He wholesale rejects either the traditional 15th or 13th centuries as options for the Exodus, in spite of the textual evidence that points to these possibilities. He affirms that there is absolutely no, listen to this, there is absolutely no evidence of human occupation at the area during the late Bronze Age, when the Exodus scenarios are implied to have occurred according to the Bible. And alternatively, he postulates that the Exodus occurred in the 23rd century BC, in the early Bronze Age, over 1,000 years earlier than the Bible proposes. Admittedly, the area is replete with evidence of human occupation and even cultic and religious type architecture and iconography, some of which he greatly overinterprets, which I'll give you an example of in a moment. But such activity has tended to characterize humanity in some fashion for millennia, so this is not very strong evidence to substantiate his claims. Typical of his somewhat strained approach is his interpretation of this drawing. Look at the drawing, listen to his explanation. This is verbatim out of him. Divided into 10 spaces, this grid may represent a rectangular stone tablet. Although no writing or symbols are engraved in the 10 spaces, the author speculates that this rock drawing may depict the tablets that contain the 10 commandments. What? What's he been smoking? Anyway, a further peculiarity is another affirmation relative to the Decalogue. Again from Anati in 1985. The Bible is not explicit as to what was engraved on the tablets containing the 10 commandments. What? I mean, basically he's discarding out of hand what the Bible says, with except the idea of a Sinai. There's another quote, but I'm going to skip it. Methodologically, one should not reject a theory simply because something is peculiar about it, but the arguments that Anati proposes fail to conform even generally to the data in the Hebrew Bible. The proposal seems more whimsical than rational. The Central Sinai Peninsula. The second area, and by far the more prevalent, is to locate Mount Sinai near the southern tip of what is commonly called the Sinai Peninsula. Several peaks cluster to serve as the general geographic region for the identification of Mount Sinai, and admittedly, I am not in a position to argue strongly for one location as opposed to another, so don't press me on it either. The three main contenders are Jebel Musa, at the foot of which is Mount St. Catherine's Monastery, Jebel Sirbal, and Jebel Katerina. In spite of the preponderance of belief that Sinai should be located in the Sinai Peninsula, negative evidence has obscured our identification of the site. One is the interior of the Sinai has never been heavily traveled, at least until relatively modern times, except on the 2 or 3 trade routes that cross the peninsula. Given God's desire to avoid the overt threat of war in the newly formed ragtag army, see the implication above, the trade routes would have been locations to expect armed opposition to appear and hence to avoid. Secondly, since the interior of Sinai was not heavily traveled, it is probable that the names associated with the sites would vary through time and/or with the nationality of the people associated with them. For instance, the Israelites perhaps would name places differently than other people who would travel in the region, such as when the place of grumbling for water was named Massah and Meribah, which the Bible explicitly explains that's why they named it that. It's a grumbling place. And to expect the names to stick over a large period of time with only minimal visitation through the centuries is probably unrealistic. Thirdly, there is little evidence of significant pilgrimage activity to sites in the Sinai, except to Jebel Musa and Mount St. Catherine Monastery. And that pilgrimage tends not to be significant until modern times. As far as the Bible is concerned, and peculiarly, the only visit to one of the sites associated with the Exodus was Elijah's long-distance trek to Mount Horeb in 1 Kings 19. There is thus reason to infer that pilgrimage to Sinai sites by the Israelites was likely rare, thus adding to the likelihood that the identification would fade in memory. Fourthly, a downside to this attribution as the location of Mount Sinai is that its tradition basically goes back to the mid-4th century A.D., when it was identified in a travel itinerary by a pilgrim named Agaria, and she did, however, indicate that there was some earlier tradition associated with Jebel Musa, but still the attribution postdates the Exodus by over a millennium. Conversely, something came up. Conversely, there are several circumstantial situations that point to the viability to identify the southern Sinai Peninsula as a suitable location. Hoffmeyer lists several. One of those is that Dionysius of Alexandria noted that, quote, persecuted Egyptian Christians fled to South Sinai for safety. He asks, could they possibly have chosen this area because they believed it was biblical Sinai and Horeb, and like the persecuted prophet Elijah, went there for safety and in hopes of rekindling the theophany as the prophet experienced? It's a fair question to which there are no answers. The itinerary list of Numbers 33, formed critically, conformed to a legitimate itinerary motif, such as those of those of Thutmose III and Ramesses II. Thirdly, Elijah's pilgrimage trip to Horeb tends to imply some significance of the memory of a Sinai episode. Fourthly, there was a tendency to locate pilgrimage sites at points for relatively easy access, thus enhancing their economic value. The very challenges and hazards to get to these remote locations hint at an element of legitimacy, since they would not be easily accessible, and likely would be economically unviable. And fifthly, and this is looking at just naturalistically, the ecology of the area is more conducive to sustain a large population as contrasted with the major contenders. And this is all the more the case toward the southern end of the peninsula, away from the more central areas. While it is difficult to determine exactly which peak in the Sinai Peninsula is the most suitable candidate for the Sinai experience, three tend to be the focus of most consideration: Jebel Musa, which is there, Jebel Katharina there, and Jebel Serbal over here. But I'm not going to go into a discussion of any of the three. The next contender is that of Jebel el-Lawz, and this is one that often catches the TV specials. A third and increasingly popular postulate for Mount Sinai is to identify it with Jebel el-Lawz in modern Saudi Arabia. A major impetus for this identification is the fact that it is in Arabia, and thus conforms to a modern understanding of Paul's remark in Galatians. And there's a circular reasoning then that comes into play. However, we know from Herodotus and the Septuagint that Arabia was geographically much more wide-ranging than modern Saudi Arabia, even including the Sinai Peninsula. See discussion above. One objection to identifying Mount Sinai with southern Sinai Peninsula is that the commonly identified peaks show no evidence of volcanic activity. Many assume that since the Lord's descent onto the mountain, as described in Exodus 19, with a manifestation of thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud, along with the fact that the Lord descended on it in fire and that the whole mountain trembled greatly, that the mountain should be identified with a volcano. On Jebel el-Lawz, people have identified a blackened mantle which has been interpreted to be evidence of volcanic activity. Problematic, however, is that this blackened stone is not volcanic in this case. The blackened color of the top of Jebel el-Lawz is explained by geologists as a phenomenon known as desert varnish, which is a black to brown coating of iron, manganese, and clay that commonly forms on exposed rock and artifacts in desert environments. I have seen exactly that phenomena on the rock formations north of Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm not going to postulate that Phoenix is the location of Mount Sinai. It would be an ideal medium for petroglyphs, chipping away the black mantle and the brightened color below showing up, such as what we have here at Jebel el-Lawz. Furthermore, we must remember that while God can, and sometimes did, use natural phenomena as means by which to do something, He can also abandon all aspects of natural law and directly intervene in the activities of humanity to make a point, changing water to wine, and especially the resurrection. Thus, a volcano is not necessary. If it had been a volcano, there would have been a supernatural intervention to keep Moses from being fried to a crisp. The other features that are proffered as evidence of that Mount Sinai are the 12 columns that are shown in this, that Moses erected at the base of the mountain, and even possibly the cave identified into which Elijah retreated in his flight to Horeb. Hoffmeyer responds to these proposals to emphasize the features generally appear to come from a much later period. This column looks more classical era than it does late Bronze Age, such as what we have columns of late Bronze Age sites in this Sarabet el-Kadim and the other site at Timnah. Three major, what time we got?
15 more minutes.
I thought it was 15 minutes before.
I looked at it wrong.
Time stands still. This is such a wonderful lecture. Either that, it's so boring that nothing has changed. Take your pick on that. Three major, I can slow down a little bit. Thank you. I'm glad I asked. Three major routes are proposed to get to Jebel el-Lawz. And I think this is one of the biggest weaknesses that's proposed. One takes them, the group, through the central part of Sinai Peninsula and crosses the Gulf of Aqaba at a site known as Nuweiba. This is the route that Ron Wyatt proposes. A second takes Israel down part of the western edge of the Sinai Peninsula before turning eastward toward Nuweiba. I don't know which of these two he subscribes to, but I know he does not subscribe to the third one. The third route takes the Israelites all the way down the western coast of the Sinai Peninsula to the southern tip, where they cross at the junction between the southern tip and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So in this case, they would come all the way down here, and the crossing site is here as opposed to up there. A major problem of the routes is the time that would have been involved to pass from Sukkot Migdal, which the Bible indicates is another aspect of their beginning point, in the upper Suez area to the Gulf of Aqaba. Moses' initial proposal, now this is background material that's critical. Moses' initial proposal was for the Israelites to go 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord. Exodus chapter 5, verse 3. A proposal that Pharaoh rejected out of hand. Now, from that, I think we need to infer you could get away from Egypt in a 3-day journey. Okay? Because that's his point. Pharaoh later offered to let Israel sacrifice in the land, but Moses insisted that they needed to go 3 days into the wilderness to do so. Exodus 8. He indicated that Israel needed to be out of the domain of Egypt's prying eyes, since there was a chance that the Egyptians would find their sacrifices offensive. It is not clear whether 3 days into the wilderness means from Ramesses or after leaving the country. However, the distance, as a crow flies, from Ramesses to the probable line of the wall of Shur, that boundary wall idea, would have been is about 35 miles. It is reasonable, therefore, to infer that the wall of Shur was essentially the boundary. The wall probably coincided somewhat with the line of the Gulf of Suez and its northern canal and lakes extensions, which serve as a fairly natural boundary line. And these kind of features are fairly standard boundary demarcations between countries. Jordan River, Rio Grande, although that one seems to be rather permeable. Anyway. Admittedly, there are a number of assumptions, and please listen. Admittedly, there are a number of assumptions in the previous proposal, but they are reasonable ones, and to place the exit from Egypt all the way across the Sinai Peninsula certainly puts the boundary of Egypt way beyond a 3-day trek, a distance at a minimum of 180 miles. A proposal to explain traversing this great distance in 3 days is to focus on God's statement in Exodus 19 as almost literally, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself, Exodus 19, verse 4. While the statement is intended to convey speed, there is no reason necessarily to infer a supernatural intervention at this point when God speaks these words after the enemy Egyptians had already been dispatched in Exodus 14. This statement was made apparently at least 10 to 11 days after the crossing of the Red Sea, according to the book of Exodus. Furthermore, if the crossing of the Red Sea was anywhere along the Gulf of Aqaba, the distance to pursue the Israelites by the Egyptians raises its own set of problems. Hoffmeyer has suggested, and a view of the chariotry would confirm this, that the chariots would not have survived in the very rough terrain of the Sinai Peninsula over such a long distance, riding on that kind of topography. This is the chariot that was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And this is actually a portrayal of the chariot of Ramesses II in his battle against the Hittites. Notice how thin those wheels are. This would not hold up well in a rocky kind of terrain. They would shatter rather quickly. Now, one could argue these are royal representations. Okay, I concede that, but these are the only kind that we have available. And we do have these available. And so the point at least has some validity. The only firm chronological indicator of the time from Egypt to Sinai is that the Passover occurred, and this is sort of an accordion kind of thing. The Passover occurred on the 15th day of the first month, Exodus 12, and they apparently arrived at Mount Sinai on the first day of the third month, a span of some 45 days. Within this span needs to occur the unknown days of Israel's meandering in the eastern delta of Egypt, before they found themselves on the banks of the Red Sea, where Pharaoh attempted to reclaim them, Exodus 14, plus the time that it would have taken them to make the trip from the Red Sea to Sinai, and at least several days in the wilderness of Sin where the manna episode unfolds. Because you remember the manna episode, they're at least almost, if not over a week. Because You gather it every day for 6 days, and on the 6th day you gather enough for the 7th day, but you don't go back. So that implies they're there for several days in order, and God gets angry with them because of their refusal to listen. So there's a chronology issue that comes into play. The issue of distances creates its own set of problems. It is important not to impose on the ancient distances a time travel that equates anything of modern times. The earlier discussion about the travel along the way of the Philistines demonstrates that the travel on average did not tend to exceed much beyond 15 miles per day. This, however, was with a trained and relatively disciplined military, usually with a contingent of support elements to facilitate their travel. Generally, as a rule of thumb, we cannot use a figure that exceeds 20 miles a day to be the rate of travel, and most would readily recognize that with the presence of sheep and goat, cattle, and young ones, the rate likely would drop precipitously. Barry Beitzel, a scholar who has devoted his research to historical geography, has calculated the average distance per day traveled in the ancient world. His data come from archives of itineraries and military annals of Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Persia, and Asia Minor, along with data that appear within the biblical text. Quote, "The evidence is generally uniform and mutually corroborating that one day's journey in the ancient world incorporated 17 to 23 miles." End quote. Travel data from the classical world, and even up until a century ago, yield similar results. The Bible narrates the Israelites leaving Pi-hahiroth and going to Mount Sinai in what appears to have been normally 10 stops, assuming that the reference to each site refers to a stop. And this is the list. From Pi-hahiroth, 3 days to Etham. By the way, the name Pi-hahiroth means mouth of the canal, which tends to place that as part of the canal system and perhaps lake system. And perhaps they go the 3 days nonstop. It's not clear, but it got 3 days in the wilderness to Etham to Marah. And perhaps this was in a hurry to get away from the events of the Red Sea and the fear of retaliation. They go to Marah, to Elam, to Yam Suf, Red Sea, Wilderness of Sin, Dofka, which means turquoise. And it's interesting that turquoise only appears on the breastplate of the high priest in Sinai context. Otherwise, turquoise does not appear within the biblical narrative beyond that. To Alush, Rephidim, and eventually then to Sinai. The distance, if following the mid-range of the estimate above, would be a maximum of 180 to 200 miles. The distance from what is assumed to be Pi-hahiroth in Egypt to Jebel Musa is 170 miles, within the range of travel implied by the text. In addition, Jebel Musa also conforms nicely to the implied distance given in Deuteronomy 1 verse 2, which reveals that the distance from Mount Sinai to Kadesh was an 11-day journey. That's explicit. The distance from Jebel Musa to the site of Ein Kadesh, Ein Kaderat, Kadesh Barnea, is about 200 miles, also within the range of travel for the Israelites. I'm going to skip this next discussion because of time. An overall problem that occurs, by the way, you might, if you can listen and look at that, I have to talk about this. This is back to the Har-Harkom discussion. The slide over here is the route that he proposes to Har-Harkom. Notice its proximity to Kadesh Barnea. And then they leave Kadesh Barnea. Where is it? They leave Mount Sinai. And this is the wandering for 11 days to get to Kadesh Barnea. That is not a very direct route at all. The children of Israel have not rebelled yet. I mean, this is wandering in the wilderness before they need to wander in the wilderness. I wonder what his wandering mind he has. Anyway, let's skip the discussion. Okay. This is a photograph of what many will propose is the site of Kadesh Barnea, which nobody knows for sure where that is. And anyway, an overall question that beleaguers the discussion of tracing the route of the Exodus is the challenge to trace a group of people in the wilderness. Without physical evidence of their presence, many infer the events did not occur. One would normally expect that such a large group of people would leave traces as they traveled and camped in the area. And I'm often asked this by people, where are all the burials, where are all the bones, and so forth and so on. And I usually retaliate by saying, where are all the bones of the bison that used to run the plains of the central U.S.? Millions of bison, and those are not little animals. Anyway, that said, however, the ability to trace Bedouin migrations and camps in the desert have proved challenging by a number of scholars. Hoffmeyer narrates not only the challenge of tracing recent camp remains, which were the result of his excavations at Tel Borg, but also the propensity of these remains easily to be buried under the blowing sand and dust of the desert. A question we might pose is, what kind of goods would we expect? Overwhelmingly, the preponderance of material that we find in an archaeological project is broken pottery. Pottery, however, would be an unlikely commodity for one traveling in the desert, walking on donkeys and/or in carts. Think in terms of our own experiences simply moving and the care with which we must pack our fragile items to protect them from breakage. Many of the famed Tel El Amarna tablets, 3 minutes. Oh. Many of the famed Tel El Amarna tablets found their demise in exactly this fashion. When the tablets were first discovered in 1887, they were ignored as forgeries, and then somebody gathered them up thinking they might be able to sell them to tourists and put them in 2 bags on the back of a donkey, drove the donkey to Karnak, and a lot of them had been crushed into dust because they'd not been packed very nicely. More practical in such migratory efforts would be vessels of wood, leather, and metal. Wood and leather would over time deteriorate, while the metal, bronze, and copper would be recycled into new items. Indeed, until modern times, the vessel of choice among those who travel for any distance are skins. Water skins, just like this. When Abraham sent Hagar off from the camp in Genesis, he gave her a skin of water. Text is explicit. The Gibeonite deception in Joshua used wineskins as a prop to deceive Joshua into thinking they had traveled a long distance. When Hannah went to Shiloh, she took a skin of wine. The depiction of the Semites in the Beni Hassan tomb painting shows 2 of the men with skin of liquid slung over their shoulders. Indeed, until recently, the Bedouin Arab community prevalently used skins as their water containers, because these, from a practical standpoint, serve much more suitably. They're less prone to breakage. They can be repaired, which may come as a surprise to you. They can conform nicely to the shoulder and contour of the shoulder, and the slow seepage through the skin helps keep the contents cool. It's a very practical kind of device to use. Peculiarly, give me 1 minute. Peculiarly, the Bible almost anticipates the question when Moses, here's an example of one of those guys, anticipates the question when Moses affirms that Israel's clothes and sandals did not wear out during their wanderings. If their clothes nor sandals wore out, might we infer that other necessities might be similarly preserved? If God so miraculously preserved them in the wilderness, what would we expect to find? That's it. Thank you. Do we have time for any questions? A question or two? Yes, sir.
Where a lot of maps that I've looked at talk about Midian being on that eastern side of Aqaba.
Right.
So how does that play anything? It says Moses was in Midian, and then he's out with the sheep when he is called by God in the bush. So does that play into this? He's on the eastern side of Aqaba.
But
how does that translate into this?
I don't think the placement of Midian on the eastern side of Aqaba, and I'm inclined to agree with that. Pastoralists in this time period drive their sheep over very wide-ranging areas. And so that does not preclude him going into the Sinai Peninsula. And there are places in the Sinai Peninsula that are very well suited for pasturing, especially the southern part of Sinai. Northern Sinai, not so much.
So it wouldn't have been unheard of for him to go.
No, wouldn't have been unheard of. Right. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your attention and your kind presence, and I wish you safe travels as you return home.